I am Dr. Mindy, and I'm here today to talk about trauma and the brain and why educators should care about trauma and also what we can do about it. Okay, so first I'm going to take a little poll. Be ready to raise your hand. I need some interaction here. Who has heard the term PTSD and kind of has an idea of what that is? Pretty much almost everyone in the room, right? Okay, now who has had a student in their room, in their office, or in their building who has PTSD? A couple people, not as many. So I would argue that probably all of you have. All right, and here's why I think that and how I came to that conclusion. Because places like the CDC, the American Psychological Association, U.S. Health and Human Services, and the National Survey on Children's Health, big organizations like that have taken this kind of information about children and how whether or not they're exposed to trauma and what that looks like. Every one of those organizations estimates that between 50% and 66%, 50 to 66% of children will experience or witness a significant traumatic event before they're 18. That's a lot of kids experiencing a lot of trauma. That's why we should care as schools. We're seeing them, we're dealing with them, whether we like it or not. And we can't get to what we do, which is reading, writing, and arithmetic, unless we teach them how to regulate. So that's really the fourth R. It should be the first R, right? Regulating, reading, writing, and arithmetic. So let's talk about what trauma is. Trauma is any kind of event. A traumatic event is any kind of occurrence where the person involved is overwhelmed with fear for their life or their selfhood, horror or terror, and they cannot get out of it, and they have a feeling of hopelessness. That's key to trauma because people go through things all the time that are, could be considered traumatic, and they manage them or they cope with them. I'll get to how they do that in just a second. But the key there is the feeling of helplessness and inability to escape that overwhelming feeling of terror or horror or fear for your life, okay? So now we know that kids come to us with trauma. We know what trauma is. That's why it's important for us. I want to talk a little bit about the brain and how trauma affects the brain. So there's kind of three ideas here that I want to get to. The first two are real short, and the third one I'm going to take a few minutes on. So the first thing is your brain's job, its main job at the end of the day is survival. Okay, your brain does a ton of things, obviously, but at the end of the day, its job is to keep you alive. So survival is job one of the brain, and that's going to be important in a minute. The other thing I want to talk about is that your brain loves patterns. Once your brain has done something a time or two, that's the default reaction, okay? That response gets faster and it gets stronger. It's much more efficient once you've done it and created a pattern for how to respond to something, okay? Now the third part that I want to spend a little bit more time on is brain development. So before you were born, each and every one of us develops in much the same way. The first part of your brain to develop is the brain stem, okay? It's at the back of your head. Some people call it the lizard brain. It has the function of, breathing, heart rate, super basic survival mechanisms, okay? The next part of your brain is the midbrain. It's right in the middle of your brain and right in the middle of your head. So if we're looking at a model of the brain, my wrist here would be the brain stem, this would be the midbrain, and then this would be the last part, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So the midbrain is also called the mammal brain. This is where the development of things like threat detection, fear responses, also belonging and connectedness and emotional regulation, those all develop within the limbic system in a little thing called the amygdala, which I'll talk about in a second. The last part of your brain to develop is the forebrain. The forebrain is the pink, wrinkly stuff that you think of when you think of the brain. So brainstem, midbrain, forebrain, it's all around, okay? And the very front of your brain is your prefrontal cortex, that's right here. And the functions that are developed in that prefrontal cortex are things like attentional control and focus, problem solving, decision making, higher order language processing, okay? That's really important to learning and what we do in schools, right? All right, so here's why it's important to know about that sequence of brain development. When you're experiencing a threat or a trauma, your brain backs right up, okay? The prefrontal cortex shuts off immediately, and you're in your emotional brain. You're in, am I safe? Are there people here that I can connect to? How do I manage this? So when a kid comes into our doors, into our schools, and they've experienced trauma, their brain has formed a pattern for how to respond to that, to keep them safe and keep them alive. All right, they've already established that. That doesn't have anything to do with you. What does have a lot to do with you is when they come into your room or your building, your office, and they feel threatened. The amygdala, whose entire job is to scan for threats in the environment, and it does it every second of every day, and it's very good at it. Your amygdala is not good at telling time. Your amygdala is not good at assessing the level or severity of threat. So when they come into your classroom and they have a pattern for how to respond to something traumatic or threatening, and they feel threatened by something you say, something you do, a touch, whatever it might be, it doesn't have to be a threat, it just has to feel like one to their amygdala. And it immediately sends out the same response that it knows how to do in trauma situations, okay? What are those responses? Fight, flight, or freeze. We've all heard of that, right? Fight or flight. There's also freeze. So what does that look like in a classroom? In the classroom, what that looks like is a kid who's getting prepared to fight is going to be yelling. He's going to be blaming other people. He might be aggressive in tone or in behavior. Sometimes those kids get up and physically fight. They're hitting people, they're throwing things, right? You've probably seen a kid like that. If they're getting ready for flight, those are the kids that are real shaky and restless in their chairs. They might never leave their seat, but they are ready to run, okay? They're distracted, they're off task, they're not looking at you, they're scanning around like this. Some kids escalate and they run right out of your room, right out of your building, down the street. And you've seen those kids too. And if neither of those things work, then they go to freeze mode. Freeze is just, I'm gonna sit here and be small, hopefully nothing bad happens. Those kids, they have their hoodies up over their face, they're sitting like this, they're non-responsive, they're numb. We've seen those kids too. So what do we do about it as educators? That seems pretty hopeless, right? So far, not good news. Kids come to us, we have nothing to do with their backgrounds and what's happened outside of our buildings or our environment, if you're cyber, whatever that looks like for you. So it seems like how can we make a difference? How can we change that? As educators, it's a biological response. It's a feedback loop between your brain and your body. What do we do? Well, the good news is this. We are educators, and we can teach them how to respond, okay? There's a set of skills that you can help kids learn to manage that. You can also teach kids about their brain and how it works. Usually, when kids are taught about their amygdala and what it does and that feedback loop and how all of that works on a biological level, their first response is, I'm not just bad, which breaks my heart. So we teach them. That's what we do as educators. We teach them about their brain and how it works. We teach them why it's happening. These are the kids who act out, right? And you talk to them afterwards and you say, what did you do wrong? And they can tell you. What are you gonna do next time? And they can tell you. Okay, everything's good, because at that moment they're calm. They can plan, they can think, they can organize. The minute something happens to them again, what do? Same responses they had before. Like we never even had that conversation, right? Why is that? Because the minute they feel that threat response goes out, and their prefrontal cortex, the planning, the execution, the problem solving, is offline. Those tools are no longer available to them. We cannot expect them to use tools that they can't access in the moment. So again, we teach them about their brains and how it works, but also what do we do? What do we do about those behaviors? Because those kids are the ones who are sent to the office and sent home and constantly being in the disciplinary cycle. And I will tell you right now that the disciplinary procedures that are in schools are designed from a behavioral standpoint, and they have no allowance for any neuroatypical behavior or any trauma-based behavior at all. When you put a kid who is having a trauma-based behavior problem into a system or a series of rules and consequences that are behaviorally based, all that does is reinforce the trauma cycle every time. And sometimes you get those kids to be quiet. That just means they've entered freeze mode. They have given up, all right? So again, as educators, how do we make a difference in this cycle? I'm looking at that clock and I don't have enough time. We teach them about their brains. I already said that. But we also teach them how to make a change in their brains. So one really cool thing about your brain and body and that message cycle that goes back and forth is that 80% of the messages that go between your brain and body, sensory-wise, go from your body to your brain. From your body to your brain. So what can we do about that? We can do body work to help kids signal their brains that everything is okay. How do we do that? Well, if your fists are clenched and you're ready to fight, your brain is like, let's go, let's rumble, right? Go like this. It's not that hard, right? Slow your breath down. Take some deep breaths. Close your eyes. Remove yourself from being overstimulated. Those are all things we can control, and those are all things we can teach kids how to do. And then what happens? Their body tells their brain that it's okay, and this is a safe place. It helps them feel seen and connected as well, because you're not just punishing for something that they really can't help. So I've got not enough time. I have a lot of strategies that you can use as an individual. So if you are a guidance counselor or an administrator or a nurse or somebody who sees kids one-to-one, there's things that you can do with those kids in that moment on an immediate basis to help them calm their bodies down and help their brains re-regulate. It's called co-regulation. You have to have an adult who's calm to do it. And that's also part of that disciplinary cycle. Sometimes the adults get kind of revved up too, right? You have to have a calm adult so they can co-regulate with a student, all right? But that's something you can do one-to-one. At a classroom level, if you're a teacher or if you run groups of some kind and you have 20, 30, or maybe 40 kids, with you at a time, there's also classroom procedures, things that you can do proactively, touch points, 2x10s, all kinds of routines that you can put into your classroom. And if you're a district level or building level administrator, oh my gosh, I have so many ideas about how you could revamp your discipline process. And it doesn't mean ignoring bad behaviors. It just means meeting the emotional and safety and connectedness need and then addressing the outward expression of that, which is what we call behavior, right? The biggest protest I hear against this is we don't have time. Well, I would argue this. These kids come in, they have trauma, they have behaviors. You are going to either deal with those behaviors or you are going to take some time and prevent them and educate kids. But either way, you are going to spend the time. And that's it. My time's up. Thank you very much.